Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to be chairing this first roundtable that is in the context of the online conference that the Generating Respect project is organizing. The conference is on the role of religious actors and humanitarian norms compliance in armed conflict, roles, influence, and engagement. And today's panel, today's roundtable is going to be focusing specifically on civilian engagement as a strategy to enhance norm compliance in armed conflict. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce the speakers today. We have great speakers. The first one is going to be Rebecca Sutton. Rebecca is as all the speakers today, they have very long bios, so I'm going to be short here because I think it's better if they have more time to share their thoughts and knowledge. So Rebecca Sutton is a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at the University of Edinburgh Law School, where she researches on the role of emotions in international humanitarian law. This month, in December 2021, Rebecca is joining the University of Glasgow as a senior lecturer in international law, and her first book was published early this year, entitled The Humanitarian Civilian by Oxford University Press. Then we're going to have Mr. Omar Ahmed. He is currently the deputy head of region for Middle East and North Africa and Colombia Geneva Call. And before that, he has worked for over 12 years with the humanitarian sector with different humanitarian organizations such as MSF in the Middle East and Sahel regions. Then we have Dr. Catherine Fortin. She's an associate professor at Utrecht University, where she teaches international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and public international law. She has widely published on the topic of non-state armed groups and international law, and her book was published in 2017 by Oxford University Press on the accountability of armed groups under human rights law. And last but not least, we have Professor Andrew Clapham. He's a professor of public international law at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, which he joined in 1997. And his most recent book, because he has a long list of books, is entitled War by Oxford University Press, that was published, if I'm not mistaken, in July this year. I'm very happy to be chairing this panel. I think it's going to be a great panel. My name is Ezekiel Efes. I should have introduced myself. I'm a senior policy and legal advisor at Geneva Call. So before giving the floor to the speakers, I would like to share a few points on the project and on Geneva Call, and on the goals of the roundtable today. So first of all, the Generating Respect project is a project that aims at understanding the role of religious leaders in conflict settings. So whether they have a role influencing parties to a conflict in various conflict settings around the world, such as Colombia, Myanmar, Libya, Mali, Syria, and Yemen. And the goal is to see whether these religious actors, these religious leaders, influence situations of respect of international humanitarian law, or even violations of international humanitarian law. And the project is actually is grounded on fieldwork activities that have been undertaken already in Mali, and also it is expected that further and additional fieldwork activities are going to be undertaken in the other contexts that I mentioned. Geneva Call is a humanitarian organization that is partnered with this project, and it's a humanitarian organization that engages armed non-state actors on humanitarian norms around the world, and has been doing that for over 20 years, obtaining humanitarian commitments by non-state armed groups, by armed non-state actors around the world on different thematic issues. So with having said that, I would like to give the floor first to Rebecca. Then the idea would be to have a dynamic panel in which I encourage those who are listening us from all around the world to ask questions, because I think that will help very much the interactions and also the sharing of the thoughts by the speakers. So first is going to be Rebecca, then the order is going to go with Omar, then Catherine, and last Professor Clapham. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ezekiel, for the kind introduction. And thank you also to Joanna for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today. And I'm going to jump right in because I have 7 minutes. So Ezekiel, if you can just confirm for me when these slides come up, can you see that there?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to set my timer here to keep me on track. So what I'll be speaking about today is really, it starts from a simple question of who should be spared the violence of war. Now, we know in international humanitarian law that there's a very specific answer to this question, which comes in the form of the principle of distinction. And for international lawyers, when we think of the principle of distinction, we'll think of Article 48 of the First Additional Protocol. And put simply, there's this idea of a bright line binary distinction between civilians and combatants, and all civilians and civilian objectives are to be protected from intentional targeting in war. And this is with the exception of some situations that I won't get into today. But when we think about this principle of distinction and we think about how to understand the way it works in practice, a classical image would be something like this, where you have a soldier looking through a viewpoint and trying to discern who's a legitimate target in war. And what I wanted to do in my research is draw attention to a different group of civilians, and that's international humanitarian actors. So I include people like this World Food Program staff member who's standing around a sort of militarized looking convoy, but also members of the Red Cross family and NGOs like Mercy Corps and Oxfam. And what I wanted to understand is, how do these humanitarians assert their civilian status on a daily basis in relationship to others in the conflict zone? Now, I realized really quickly that, based on my practice-based experience in Sudan and in South Sudan, that if I wanted to understand distinction, I couldn't look at humanitarians alone. I had to look at military and peacekeeping actors who also share the operational space with them, some of whom would be categorized as combatants. And we have this image here where you see a sort of quasi-military looking peacekeeper, but in the background, we have the UNICEF logo and the UNHCR logo on the roof. So my question is to ask, what's going on in this picture with distinction? And where is the humanitarian civilian? And so what I set out to do in my doctorate and in the book is to take this kind of situation. So this is an imagined scene from South Sudan, where you have humanitarians engaging with local civilians, and then UNMISS peacekeepers roll onto the scene. And they will generally be categorized as civilians in international law, but they appear military-like or combatant-like with their weapons, their clothing, their vehicles, and so on. And what I find is that in everyday life, humanitarians work to assert a distinction from these other actors and also from the local civilians they engage with. And so I go into this in much more detail in the book, but I'll try to explain in my last 4 minutes how I think distinction works on the ground. And I'd like to argue specifically that in international practice, we find a civilian plus figure circulating. So if you take the image that I showed you earlier, where we had a bright line distinction from the First Additional Protocol, and I showed you on one side the combatant and the other side the civilian. Now, if we just throw that image away, I want to suggest a very different vision of distinction that I think humanitarians might be promulgating in their daily practice. And in this vision, anyone could attract qualities of what I call civilianness, which we would associate with innocence, harmlessness, and non-participation, or equally qualities of combatantness, which we might associate with being complicit, dangerous, participating in the fight. And what's crucial in this vision is that we no longer have a civilian status and a combatant status. Instead, we have a civilianness continuum, and different kinds of civilians can be found jostling with each other for positioning to be more or less civilian. So the crucial thing here in this dynamic vision of distinction is that civilianness is a matter of degree rather than of category. And this explodes really everything we know as IHL lawyers from the Geneva Conventions. But I think it's a more accurate depiction of what we see as a matter of perception and practice on the ground. And so I think that 3 different statuses can be produced through this kind of jostling. And there's a trade-off here because I'm bringing us back to a sort of static vision of different kinds of statuses, but I think it has analytical value. So what I argue is that the civilian plus status is what humanitarians are longing for. There's this idea that you still have the civilian inviolability, but on top of that, something that indicates the more pure status. Now, the mere civilian is the status that's by default given to all civilians, so ordinary civilians belonging to the general civilian population. And I argue that humanitarians want to escape the weakness of this default status. Then finally, we have the civilian minus, and I argue that this status haunts humanitarian practices. So anytime they're accused, for example, of feeding the enemy, we see this idea of a combatant-like or civilian minus status circulating. And I'll just finish by sharing my intervention in terms of the normative question of, do we desire these special civilians in international law? Is this something we want to break up the civilian category and recognize the particular needs of different civilian groups? And my intervention here as a scholar is to sound a note of caution and wariness. So I argue that ultimately the civilian plus presents us with a paradox. On the one hand, the power of a special civilian figure derives from the notion that lesser civilians exist out in the world. And this, I argue, serves to weaken the norm of general civilian protection. But the more beleaguered and undermined the civilian ideal becomes, the more desirable the prospect of a special status appears. In other words, it's precisely because the civilian is undermined and questioned at every turn that humanitarians would long for something more. So my intervention really for international lawyers is to ask, what might we be doing to the civilian category if we tacitly or overtly allow a carve out from the category for humanitarian actors, especially given that this would set them in a hierarchy above the lives of those civilians who provide them with their raison d'etre. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I thought it was a fascinating intervention, and I think the topic is quite relevant for humanitarian actors. I'm going to ask you. Actually, I think there are two thoughts that come to mind. That when I hear about the different types of civilianness, it's like when I think about the DPH guidelines, that sometimes they list different acts that can either contribute or not to the conduct of hostilities, or can be considered as, it's like the distribution of food, of finances, or of course a store of ammunition. I mean, the different types of acts that can or cannot. The whole discussion about DPH. And I hear about your research, and I think it fits perfectly there. On the different type of acts that can lead or not to considering whether a person is directly participating in hostilities or not. So this is the first thought that came to mind. And the second one is, of course, in your recent book and in your research, you discuss the principle of distinction, and it's like and the question that I have when you discuss about these signifiers of civilianness in everyday practice. So my question is, to what end that that has actually consequences for the civilian population, if that has consequences for the civilian population. Yes, thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ezekiel. It's always lovely to be back in conversation with you. So the first one, thanks for mentioning. So for those less familiar, we're talking about direct participation in hostilities, or the concept of DPH. And the rule here in IHL is that for such a time as civilians are seen to participate, they can be intentionally targeted, and that is lawful under IHL. So Ezekiel, what I argue in the book is that the very idea of DPH introduces for us a civilian minus in international law, in legal doctrine proper, so that it's a place we can look in the Geneva Conventions to find that some civilians are treated differently than others. And this challenges the whole notion that there's a bright line distinction from combatants and that there's a unified civilian category. So I use that as an example to show that even in IHL doctrine, there are different civilians. And Helen Kinsella has made the argument that DPH introduces fluidity into the distinction of a temporal sort. And I think that's right. And so I'm building on these findings to say, actually something very similar is going on with humanitarians. Now, in my own research empirically, I find that much of the behavior of humanitarians that is seen to look like a sort of civilian minus or combatant-like behavior, it would not fulfill the criteria for DPH. So it would fall short under IHL of meeting that, quite high threshold. But as a matter of perception, it can be even when humanitarians are doing quintessential tasks, like delivering food to the other side, that they are perceived to be of lesser civilian status. And in my interviews with international soldiers and military actors, something they would often say is, well, the general civilian population doesn't choose to be in a war zone, but humanitarians do. And so there's this idea that humanitarians are inserting themselves into the fight and becoming participants through their presence. And so that's a perception, whether valid or not, that's quite a widespread perception amongst the military players. But I would say as an IHL matter, a lot of this activity wouldn't meet the threshold, but it gives me the idea that there are civilian minuses. Now, secondly, in terms of the principle of distinction, what are the consequences? So my worry is the things I hear international actors say, for example, and armed non-state actors, and this can go in different directions, but often people will say, yes, all civilians are civilians, but then they'll do something to carve out humanitarians from the category. So they'll say like, oh, well, they're especially virtuous, or other actors will resent the idea that humanitarians might think they are especially virtuous or appear civilian. So there's tension there that I write about in my emotions work. But I think the real consequence for the civilian population, I draw on Didier Fassen's work, and he talks about this idea of a hierarchy of lives in humanitarian aid work. And the idea is you have this imbalance from the beginning because the humanitarian life is supposedly freely risked, whereas the lives of the civilians in the conflict zone are risked through, reasons not of their own choosing. So my concern is that if we already have this embedded inequality in humanitarianism, what would it do to rally international law to further entrench that? So if they were given some kind of lex specialis or special status, what does it do to everyone left behind in the civilian category if we're suggesting that simply being civilian isn't enough to ensure protection? So that would be my intervention there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I'm sure I see that there are already some questions for you in the chat box that are going to be addressed at a later stage. Now, without further ado, I go to Omar.
Thanks, Rebecca, for that pretty genuine and genius intervention. And thanks again, Ezequiel and Joanna, for organizing this conference and inviting me with the role of representing Geneva Call. So my intervention is going to be an operational intervention as opposed to the academic ones that the different panelists are sharing. So I'm going to be sharing with you the way we look at, from Geneva Call, the way we look at the role civilians play when it comes to enhance humanitarian law, and the way we actually treat them in order to achieve that. So in Geneva Call, as Ezequiel presented at the very beginning, we of course have a main focus of engaging armed actors and trying to increase their knowledge and their compliance with respect to international humanitarian law. But we also have a second important component of our mandate and of our interventions, and that one is the one where we look at civilian actors. So what do we mean by civilian actors within Geneva Call? So we look at, we mean civil society organizations, we mean local NGOs, we mean tribal leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, youth movements, students, journalists, media. So all of those are the usual suspects that one will see in a classical law frame, in a classical intervention of Geneva Call. So why do we target them? Why do we engage them? So we look at them as an actor of change. Again, when we engage armed actors, when we try to raise awareness about IHL and ensure or enhance their compliance, what we're trying to see here is a change of behavior. So in that theory of change, we could also look at the civilians as an actor provoking change from a different manner, from a different perspective. Now, how do we think they provoke change, and what is the theory or the path of behavioral change that we are expecting? So first of all, we believe that all of the respective civilian actors that I mentioned before, not all of them are present in all of the settings, but those that are relevant in different conflict settings, we believe that they deserve and they shall be aware of what is the normative framework within which they are being potentially abused, or they are being victims or witnessing a conflict. Therefore, we believe that they should be aware of what it is international humanitarian law and even international human rights law, for the sake of those who are under the control of certain de facto authorities and who are not anymore living a open combat situation, but who are still suffering from abuses because of the domestic security management of this de facto authority, usually very linked to armed actors. So this means that people deserve to know simple issues such as minors should not be recruited, detainees should be properly treated and properly judged before being detained, and the civilian property or the civilian infrastructure should be respected and not misused by armed actors. So all of those elements are very logical for those who work within the humanitarian sector and who investigate. But those civilians who are usually caught in the middle of a conflict all of them do not really know that those are the very basics of the rights they hold. So if we build their capacity, they should be able to identify what are the protection issues that they are encountering, what are the IHL abuses that they are victims of, and therefore, ideally, they should be able to monitor those abuses and to register those abuses. Yeah? We actually have this operational activity deployed in most of the countries we operate, which is called the IHL network, or the Friends of IHL, which is basically composed of a series of local NGOs or local civilian actors who meet regularly 2, 3, 4 times a year and simply engage on exchanging what are the different concerns they have, what are the different advocacy opportunities they foresee, and they exchange on potential synergies, etc. And also, this is a platform where they are able to actually share what they are monitoring in terms of the violations. And the last step of that potential change that civilian actors are able to provoke would be their capacity to advocate and confront duty bearers, armed or non-armed, perpetrators or potential perpetrators, and as well their capacity to report. So they can potentially report abuses or IHL violations in 2 manners. That is the operational way of reporting, meaning they could address a case of a victim or a survivor into or towards an operational actor, the classical case management programs that the NGOs have, or they could go even farther, which is reaching out to speaking out organizations and publicly denounce what they are suffering. No, I mean, of course, everybody can think about the classical organizations such as Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or other mechanisms within the UN system, like the different commission of inquiry. So the role of Geneva Call here is to ensure that we build the capacity, that we inform those civilians that are part or that are victims of the conflict, but we don't go beyond that. So that's a decision of a civilian actor, whether if that person wants to use that capacity to advocate or to denounce. Of course, the do no harm is an essential principle here, because we need to ensure that by building their capacity, we're not putting them at higher risk. So this being said, perhaps what I can do now is sharing a couple of successful examples where, by engaging civilian actors, by considering them as the potential actors of change, we have managed, or they have witnessed a behavioral change from the armed actors side of things, meaning from those who are usually the perpetrators of IHL abuses. So I know I have a minute. Perhaps I'll narrow into one example. or perhaps a couple of them in the same country. So I'm referring to our mission in Iraq, where after having engaged for a while the religious leaders in the Anbar governorate, we managed to have mediation sessions where the PMF and the religious leaders were convinced or self-convinced after discussing, and especially after engaging with us, that certain returnees could go back home. So we managed to ensure the rights of the displaced and the rights of those who were forced to leave their houses to come back home without being further or subjectively judged. And in the same country, and with this example I stopped, in the north, in this case in Sinjar, thanks to the engagement with a youth organization and to building their capacity, we managed to have them engaging and confronting with one of the armed non-state actors, who ended up understanding that they should vacate the school that they were occupying, because that school was a point of encountering of children belonging to different communities, and they realized what was the importance for the cohesion of the community and the stabilization of the town, for them to vacate the school and have kids going back to school. No, that armed actor even went farther in terms of engagement, and thanks to that intervention of that civilian organization, they came proactively to us, which is not always the case, and requested the information to engage to start engaging with Geneva Call, and end up signing commitments on respecting different thematics of IHL. So I stop it here. Thanks a lot for these 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Omar. This is very interesting, and of course I do have a couple of questions, and I encourage the people again who are listening from all over the world to ask your questions in the chat box. And after the first speakers share their thoughts, then we can open it for everyone to also reply to those questions. So the first one is just a reflection I find interesting in terms of when the traditional perspective of thinking about IHL is obviously focused on obligations of the parties and not so much of rights of individuals. So this whole idea of discussing with civilians in terms of IHL and whether they have rights in that field, I find it quite interesting. And that's simply a reflection. And in terms of the question is, perhaps if you can share a bit more what type of activities specifically as a humanitarian actor you would undertake with civilians. I mean, is it the same that you would undertake with a non-state armed group? Would it be a training on international humanitarian law? It would be perhaps to encourage the civilian community to undertake a declaration, for the village to undertake a declaration, a statement on a specific thematic area, or what type of activity would you encourage in that field?
Sure. No, thanks for the good reflection, and thanks for the question. So I would say there's an initial phase of a capacity building process. Geneva Call, usually what we do is either workshops, awareness sessions, or trainings. Very often we refer to trainings because that's the easiest way for everybody to understand when we put 30 people in a class, whether they are combatants or civilians, no matter their degree of civilianness. So on a first step or stage of that training, of course, the content of IHL, and if it applies, and we believe it's relevant, human rights as well, is going to be very similar, especially if we're talking about a similar environment where we're going to be paying attention to the thematics that are mostly at stake. However, on a second stage of that activity, that's where the change comes in, because we, as you said, Ezequiel, when we are having 25 combatants of an armed group in front of us, we're going to use the end of the training or the second or the third day, depending on the duration, to actually give them scenarios and put them into the situation of those who are in different situations. We put them into civilian or combatant situations, but we try to have them reflecting upon what is the damage that they perpetrate and why they should be avoiding and taking care of the civilians they're dealing with. No, so we look at them as responsibles, as people who have obligations. However, when we talk about civilians on that second stage of the training, basically we're also, you know, other than teaching them or showing them what is the normative framework they're living with, we actually teach them or try to build their capacity on how to identify those violations that they may be suffering, how to register them, how to monitor them, and eventually how to report, or how to well, that last step we do it on a proactive manner with focus group discussions, etc. Again, because of the do no harm approach, and because of the importance of not seeing Geneva Call as an actor, provoking or pushing civilians to denounce or to confront. But in the end, it's a way of them experiencing that capacity, no, and being able to decide by themselves whether if they want to go that way or not. Thank you, Ezequiel.
Thank you very much, Omar. So again, I encourage the people to ask questions, because I'm sure it's quite relevant. Catherine, it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Ezequiel, and congratulations to the organiser for having put together this amazing conference over the next days on this topic. It's a real honour to have been invited this evening. In the spirit of your desire to make a dynamic panel, Ezequiel, I'm going to try also to feed in a few thoughts that pull in some things that have already been said by Rebecca and Omar, because I think that what I'm going to say connects to both earlier presentations. So my findings, you've asked me to share findings on the role of civilians in enhancing compliance with IHL by armed non-state actors. And my work on this topic is part of a bigger project on civilian agency in the context of civilians living under the control of armed groups, and indeed looks at this issue that Rebecca already mentioned of the image of the civilian. So the idea that civilians are conceptualized very often as being vulnerable, uninvolved from the dynamics of the armed conflict, but in reality, that's not always the case. On this issue of engagement and how civilians engage with armed groups, I think the first finding that I can share is that there's been a lot of studies of this dynamic over the last years, which showed that civilian communities living under the control of armed groups or in territory where armed groups are active are very routinely engaging with those armed groups on those behaviours, just not using IHL as their frame of reference often. So there's really quite a wealth of emerging research on the different strategies that civilian communities adopt to survive in these situations when they're navigating situations of prolonged conflict. And these strategies very often include negotiating with armed actors and resisting armed actors in different ways. So there are lots of examples of civilian communities who have successfully persuaded armed groups to change their behaviour, or to investigate wrongs, or to provide redress. There's also examples of armed groups who have demonstrated an openness of receiving complaints from civilian communities about their behaviour. I think the main point to emphasise when one looks at these different studies is the manner in which civilians can and do interact with armed groups in any given circumstance is extremely context dependent and depends on the kind of armed group, its links with the community, the links with the community, with the state, the characteristics of the community, whether it's unified or fragmented, the dynamics of the conflict, the armed group's ideology. All of these variables that I've just mentioned, and there are probably many more, feed into what civilian communities do and can do in relation to armed actors. But also, and I think it's really crucial, how those actions will be interpreted by the other side. So there are instances where civilians have pushed back against armed groups and that action has been perceived as support for the state by the civilians. Likewise, of course, there are dangers of civilian communities getting too close to armed groups, engaging with armed groups in a manner that may make them be deemed to be affiliated with those groups from the state perspective. In many instances, of course, it's a criminal offence to dialogue with an armed group. And so gathering this kind of very fine-grained information that a lot of these studies are based on while the conflict's ongoing, I think is very difficult, which leads me to my second finding then. You asked me for 3, which is one of caution. I think that studies on civilian armed group relations often note that civilian communities try and hold themselves out as neutral. So they sort of signal neutrality. And I guess in some ways here I see some connections with Rebecca's research on the idealized ideal of a civilian. And it seems that some programs drawing on civilian communities or instances where civilian communities have engaged with armed actors in a manner seeking to change their behavior, whether on IHL or other issues, have often sought to portray the civilian communities as neutral actors, hoping thereby to keep them safe. And that, and I think it's on this instance that more research is needed, and I will be doing further research because I think that, you know, one of the ways this can be achieved is for the civilian community to reach out to both armed actors so that they are perceived as neutral. But I think there's a question as to whether this neutrality or impartiality is ever attainable by a civilian community. No matter what you find on that, there's no doubt that these civilian communities are really vulnerable. And in many situations, it has to be noted that neutrality or impartiality are actually the opposite of what's demanded from them by the armed actor. Going on to my third point then, I think that in some situations, it seems that in order to mitigate these dangers, civilians have often utilized external organizations to make them less exposed. So for example, NGOs or religious institutions. In Colombia, it was unlawful for ordinary individuals to dialogue with armed groups, but there was an exception for pastoral dialogue. So if it was done under the umbrella of a religious organization. Likewise, it can be helpful if the international community is involved. Conversely, a different avenue, I think, is for NGOs to reach out to civilians inside the armed group. So I'm thinking here of the civilian administration of armed groups, engaging with individuals who are civilians, but very more formally allied to the armed group, prevents civilians having to navigate the same perilous neutrality equation, which maybe just isn't possible. Indeed, there are indications that the civilian wing of an armed group can be a valuable entry point in putting pressure upon the military wing to change its behavior. I'll stop there because I'm out of time, but I know that many of these issues are going to be under discussion also in the roundtable. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing the presentations.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Very, very interesting topic. I have 2 actually questions. One is from Joanna Chismas. I should have mentioned her at the beginning. She's the primary investigator of the Generating Respect project, and she just shared a question for you in terms of whether if civilians actually haven't been historically been negotiating with armed actors for their own protection, if they are actually the primary humanitarian actors, if you want, because they are actually in direct contact with the armed actors on the ground, and perhaps what are the implications, and if the humanitarian actors, the humanitarian organizations, or the professionalism of the humanitarian work has actually forgotten about this role of civilians in direct contact with armed groups. And my second, actually, this is my question, is, you know, you mentioned in your presentation a couple of different groups. So you mentioned de facto authorities. So it's like if there is a civilian wing in the group. So I wonder if the impact, I mean, if we can actually draw a typology of groups in this regard, it's like if for certain groups, the influence of civilians is going to be higher than for others. It could be in terms of organization, or it could be in terms of their goals. If they're secessionist groups, it might be higher. If they're non-secessionists, it might be lower. I don't know. I'm just, yeah.
Well, thanks for the questions. Are civilians the primary humanitarian actors? I mean, it's true that, of course, civilians are the first on the ground and the last on the ground. And a lot of this, I think, with the ground bargain, the whole notion of humanitarian action being turned on its head to being a bottom-up approach, I think has fed into the reconceptualization of civilian communities as not being beneficiaries and in a way being the owners of these spaces. And yeah, so I think that on the one hand, what Joanna says is correct, that it's really important to recognize and acknowledge that civilian communities are doing this already, and they have the knowledge on the ground that very often international organizations don't have, which puts them in a very powerful position often to know how a particular armed actor's behavior might be best changed, and the entry points to do that, whether they be cultural or religious or whatever else. But they are extremely vulnerable. They don't have the emblem in the same way as the ICRC has, which gives them the protection, which I think is the reason why it's very important that this is handled so delicately in a way. And I thought that was very interesting how Omar articulated it, of the do no harm principle of empowering civilians but not encouraging them, perhaps. But I think then I would worry that that's also a tricky one, because if you know they're going to do it anyway, then maybe you need to do more than that. Maybe you need to be advising best practices, which leads me to your next question, Ezekiel, about a typology. If only we could make such a typology. I think when I've been reviewing these various studies on relationships between armed groups, I tried to make a list of all the different variables, which I already mentioned. And I think I already had at least 10 on my list, but there must be so many more. So I think it's going to be, I mean, yes, you can make a typology with such a list, and it would need to be based on, I suppose, empirical research, perhaps also looking specifically on engagement on protection issues. But I think I would be afraid to draw up such a typology, because it seems to me that the situations are also very different.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Andrew, who's going to be speaking about, well, I'm not going to say what he's going to be speaking about. Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for this invitation, and I'm really enjoying this panel now. So indeed, you've asked me to talk about the idea of a continuous application of a proportionality principle from the jus ad bellum, from the resort to force, and to think about how civilians in general could take cases before domestic courts or even international human rights courts, relying on the fact that the jus ad bellum had been violated. So this is quite a new idea, which you've highlighted from my new book, as you've mentioned before, and I'll try and explain it. So what I've noticed over time is that really there are two different types of proportionality rule that tend to get confused. The first one is well known, and it says that where you have expected collateral civilian damage, that has to be proportionate to the anticipated military advantage in any targeting decision, whether it's an attack or an attack in defense. And if you intentionally violate that proportionality rule, it means you've committed a war crime, and the party, whichever side it is, will have violated IHL. And all that is quite well known. But there's a second rule, and this is the one I want to stress and maybe talk about for 5 minutes, is that any state acting in self-defense can only use as much force as is necessary and proportionate to defend itself. And similarly, a state acting under a Security Council mandate, entitling it to use force against an armed group or another state, can only use as much state as is necessary to fulfill the mandate that the Security Council has given it, and what is necessary to restore international peace and security. So when they are targeting, it's not enough that it's in compliance with IHL, it has to be in compliance with this second jus ad bellum rule, either coming from self-defense or from the Security Council mandate. And the point that I've made in the book, and which I feel quite strongly about, is that this is not a decision that only applies on day one of the war. So you've decided it's necessary to defend yourself, you've passed that test, and now for the rest of the war, you can use as much force as you like, as long as it's in violation, in compliance with the IHL. What I'm suggesting is that each act in the armed conflict has to also be proportionate to your self-defense or your Security Council mandate. And so you have to satisfy two tests. You have to satisfy the IHL test, but you also have to satisfy the UN Charter throughout the armed conflict. So to answer your question, what would be the options for a civilian to complain that that rule has been violated? Because as you said before, civilians can't really complain usually that a violation of IHL has occurred, because that's seen as an interstate arrangement or only applicable to war crimes. But the victim doesn't really have standing to claim compensation in a lot of jurisdictions anyway. And what I'm going to highlight is that the UN Human Rights Committee, in paragraph 70 of its general comment on the right to life, has stated that an act of aggression would ipso facto violate the right to life. In other words, when a state is violating the UN Charter in the way that I've suggested, those killings become arbitrary violations of the right to life. Human rights have been violated. So the civilians that are killed, as well as any combatants, indeed will have a human rights claim. And that sort of changes the equation a bit, because human rights are justiciable, and a set of civilians could bring their claim before the Human Rights Committee, for example. And the important point here is it's not civilians whose relatives are bringing the claim. It's not about civilians who have been killed in violation of international humanitarian law. They would be covered, but it's also civilians who might have been killed not in violation of IHL, in other words, permissible collateral damage. And as you know, in today's conflicts, the states are very good at explaining how they actually had a target and they're very sorry that these civilians were killed, but it's justifiable and proportionate collateral damage. And my point is that the relatives of those individuals who had been killed would be able to make a claim that those civilians had been killed through an act of aggression in violation of the UN Charter, or alternatively as a disproportionate act in self-defense. So that opens up the idea that these individuals could complain about losses of life produced by such an aggressive or disproportionate use of force. Now, of course, some people would suggest this is all too academic and doesn't really fit with the concept of what happens in war. And there's a strain of thinking which says, you know, once a war has started, people will die, and you have to expect that human rights law is not applicable to that kind of battlefield killing. And I'm basically rejecting that idea and saying, until further notice, the Human Rights Committee is talking about violations of the right to life committed through an act of aggression, meaning that individuals could claim that their human rights have been violated. Now, of course, there are a couple of problems with all of this. One is to do with extraterritorial application of human rights law, and that's probably too big a topic to finish in a minute. But the general comment, again, has covered that, where they say there could be claims where this includes persons located outside the territory effectively controlled by the state, whose right to life is nonetheless impacted by its military or other activities in a direct and reasonably foreseeable manner. And that seems to me and to the Human Rights Committee to cover a drone strike outside the territory of the state that is making the strike. So those individuals that are killed in that drone strike would, in my view, be able to claim that their human rights have been violated. I think I'll stop there and allow any time that's left to Rebecca Sutton to answer the very good questions by Stephen Wilkinson and Deborah Bagoli.
Thank you very much. Andrew, I mean, I have just one reflection, and before we move to the questions that we have in the chat box, is I wonder, I know, do you think it's going to be difficult for state courts to actually undertake these assessments? Yes, I mean,
absolutely.
in terms of the feasibility of the IHL Jus ad bellum human rights assessment that they will have to do.
No, I mean, the question is obviously a good one, and it's almost impossible to imagine that a judge will find that his or her own state has committed an act of aggression, and therefore these individuals have a human rights claim. So I'm well aware that even an international court or a national court is not going to do this lightly. What I'm really suggesting is that it should affect the instructions that are given to a drone operator. And that when somebody in the armed forces says, but am I violating human rights if I kill this person in my TV screen? Somebody like you or Omar or Catherine says to them, actually, yes, you're going to be committing a human rights violation if you kill those people, because this is in the context of an aggression. And I was thinking, to make it a bit less abstract, what sort of example could I give you? Let's imagine the US engaging in over-the-horizon strikes in Afghanistan on ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Those acts are not going to be at the invitation of Taliban, so they're aggression. And the people who are conducting those strikes are going to be told, but this is all in conformity with IHL. And I'm saying, yes, but it's in violation of the UN Charter and it's in violation of the people's human rights on the ground. And I think that changes the way we think about targeting. So I'm not suggesting that you could easily win a case tomorrow, but I'm suggesting it would affect the way we train and consider what's a legitimate target.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So indeed, we have two questions for Rebecca. The first one is from Stephen Wilkinson, who's going to be moderating one of the panels tomorrow. I invite everyone to attend tomorrow's panels as well. So he asked if the DPH introduces a concept of civilian minus, what is introducing driving the civilian plus notion within existing treaty or from practice? And then there is a second question from Deborah. And I don't know if you want to take both questions at the same time or you want to, yes, the second question is, so for those who are not familiar with the DPH, is direct participation in hostilities. So as Rebecca explained before, those acts for which an individual can be considered to be directly participating in the conflict. And the second question from Deborah is, can the perception of humanitarians taking direct part in hostilities, for instance, by providing assistance to one side at any point in time, be countered by better understanding of the humanitarian principles?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ezekiel. Stephen, thanks for your question. I'll look forward to your panel tomorrow. So let me give some very quick answers. So here's where I think we find the civilian plus, and I'll speak briefly about treaty, case law, and practice. So treaty, if we look at the 4th Geneva Convention of 1949, I argue that this convention disaggregates civilians, not for the purpose of targeting, but for the purpose of protection and access to humanitarian services. So children of a certain age, lactating mothers, and so on, are given special dispensations, which I argue disaggregates the civilian category before we get to the 1977 additional protocol definition of the civilian. Then at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, we have crimes against humanity cases like Milosevic, where for civilians to show that at the time of the conflict they were indeed civilians, they have to do something more than just show that they aren't combatants. So they almost have to make out a civilian plus kind of identity, and there are assumptions made about how they were dressing, how they behaved, and who they were seen with, and so on. So I find a civilian plus circulating in the case law there. And finally, in practice, what I found in my project is that on a daily basis, humanitarians identify other civilians like UN peacekeepers who appear militarized, and in fact, in places like the Congo and the 4th Intervention Brigade would have combatant status. But in a place like South Sudan, most of the time they'll be civilians. But humanitarians will try to not park their vehicles near them, not participate in convoys, not be seen with them in public. And all of this is a way of enacting distinctions within the civilian category to set themselves apart. And I think that this comes from humanitarian anxieties that being tainted by proximity to peacekeepers will undermine their own civilian status, and that galvanizes this longing to prove civilian plusness, we could say. And outside of that, I've seen journalists and media professionals, as well as child advocates, argue that these other sets of actors should also be civilian plus because of their particular needs. All right, and Deborah, thank you so much. So DPHing, yes. So what I've found empirically in my work is that many peacekeepers, NATO soldiers, international military actors are not well versed in the humanitarian principles. And more specifically, they might not understand what impartiality and independence demands of humanitarian actors. Where I think there's a real problem that even is a blind spot to humanitarians is that there's a hidden conflict between humanity and the principle of distinction. So in a conflict zone, humanity might seem to demand an armed escort so humanitarians can get out to deliver services, but this could compromise perceptions of distinction. And they navigate this conflict every day, and other outside actors might find it very hard to follow the logic of their decision making. So there's space there for training and educating of non-humanitarians on the principles. Thank you so much for the excellent questions.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this thorough answers. And before we actually close the session, I would like to give the floor to everyone, all the speakers, perhaps with two reflections. The first one is, what is the biggest challenge that you see on advancing civilian engagement? And on the other way around, what's the biggest opportunity in this regard? I think we can start on the other way around, perhaps with Andrew.
Thank you. I mean, I suppose I'll just sort of continue on my theme. I think one of the biggest challenges, and maybe it doesn't quite fit what you're thinking about when you talk about civilian engagement, but I suppose it's the inability at the moment to distinguish in a lot of conflicts between who really is a civilian and who is somebody who poses a danger to, whether it's the peacekeepers or the armed forces of the state that's trying to put down a rebellion. And, you know, in the past, even for a civil war, it was much clearer. I mean, both sides might have had uniforms, and there wasn't this idea that everybody is a potential IED maker or terrorist lurking. And when I think about referring back again to Afghanistan and Syria, the idea of what are called signature strikes, so that it's the profile of how they think a civilian looks or doesn't look, what Rebecca was referring to. You've got to sort of be even more civilian than a civilian to protect yourself from attack. And I think that's a huge challenge. And I fear that at the moment, it's a lot of, we'll shoot first and then we'll deal with the inquiry later. And I think we need to change that burden of proof. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andrew. Catherine?
Yeah, so just to start with the opportunity, I think there is a real opportunity in looking more at bottom-up approach to the IHL framework, which, as you point out, Ezekiel, has so often been looked at from a top-down perspective. Civilian communities have a very good knowledge of conflict dynamics, the armed actors at various entry points, and in that regard present a lot of opportunities for successful engagement. But then the biggest challenge, I think, is for them to be kept safe while engaging. And I can imagine, as a humanitarian organization, the biggest challenge is to draw the lines as to what your role is vis-a-vis those civilian communities, and what is safe in the situation, and what can be expected of the civilian communities and what can't.
Thank you, Catherine. Omar?
No, I think in terms of the biggest challenge, I totally echo Catherine's answer. So totally in line with that. Now, perhaps in terms of the opportunities that engaging civilians for the sake of enhancing IHL is the fact that they can actually become themselves, as I said, an actor of change. But then there's also something related to maintaining the memory and the history of what has happened in a conflict, and that remains very important. And that is often a difficult thing to obtain afterwards, especially when it comes from those who have actually witnessed. There's usually very little testimonies that prove with justice what has happened within a conflict environment. So maintaining the history and the memory of a conflict is one of the advantages as well, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Omar. Rebecca?
Thanks. I'll just briefly add that I think maybe both the opportunity and the challenge, I would say, is for protection advocates. My concern would be that protection of civilians, the agenda, makes us look for a sort of perfect civilian, or a certain kind of civilian who is worthy of help. And I see an echo here with, in the criminal justice system, when we have the perfect victim, or in the refugee protection system, we have the ideal refugee. And so when we think only these ideal types are worthy of protection and assistance, I think it can prevent us from having honest conversations about how conflict zones work and the kinds of compromises people make to stay alive in armed conflict. So just that awareness, I think, could improve.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone, for your views and thoughts on this. It is clear that that the literature that portrays civilians as mere victims of war is insufficient because of all the dynamics that you describe, either because they're actively engaging with non-state armed groups or states, or because they're bringing cases before a court, or because they're the judges deciding on whether IHL violations are taking place or not. So the position of civilians in conflict settings is much more complex than of course that the traditional literature on IHL seems to portray. I would like to invite you all to the conferences and the different panels that are going to be taking place tomorrow and on Friday. They're going to be dealing with different issues on the role of religious actors and in conflict settings, and in promoting humanitarian and norms compliance or not. There are going to be some very interesting discussions, and I hope to see you all in the next few days. Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you very much to the audience as well, who actively engage in the discussion today. Thank you.